Hello, my name is Ann Fable, and I chose to do my quality of character on accountability. So, to introduce accountability a little bit, the things that I will be talking about and discussing is how accountability is applied to teams and individual athlete and coaches. We'll go over a little bit about what that looks like, how it's displayed, and the importance and why it's essential. So, getting into the next thing here, um, my personal definition of accountability to me, I think accountability is, you do what you say you're going to do. Um, there's going to come challenging times as a coach and an athlete where you're going to have a lot of reflecting. And some of the best accountability comes from people who can reflect inward rather than outward, and that they can take a lot of ownership and responsibility through stressful times without deflecting and blaming and having big reactions. So, with that being said, I think athletes too, accountability for them, I believe, is reflected through their attitude, their effort, and their behavior. And I think that their when their accountability can be aligned with their attitude, effort, and behavior, it could lead them to becoming peak performers at a high level. And not only can they become peak performers at a high level, but I think athletes who can really get in alignment with accountability in those three areas will also definitely become the best leaders. For coaches, I think, I'm a coach. I coach girls basketball. I think for us coaches, we need to be modeling and demonstrating accountability through a set of core values that we live our own personal life on, and not just the core values that we put and lay out before our team and our programs we coach. And that we need to be living our life also on a standard and expectation. So when we do go into a team or a program, the standards and expectations that we're expecting everybody else to function on, we're able to hold everybody to that without any issues. Um, Another thing with accountability, I believe that it it takes courage, and it's like a will thing. There's got to be willingness in there, because when you're going through a process, if you're coaching a season, the process of coaching a season, there's going to come a lot of stressful times. There's going to come a lot of challenges, and there's going to be a lot of mistakes made along the way. And these mistakes, they're not always just going to be made by the coach or other adults involved in the program. It could be an admin mistake, but one thing that's for sure, I think there's definitely going to be athlete mistakes. There's going to be a lot of them. There are going to be a lot of different little slips and bumps in the road coaching a team, especially if you're coaching teenagers. Oh yeah, mistakes. They're going to be there. Um, so personally, I think that these mistakes and these little mishaps, I think they should happen, because if they don't happen, how is anybody ever going to learn anything? And without those lessons, there's no growth. So those lessons, when mistakes are made, all teachable moments, definitely all teachable, and it's a good time to learn how to just admit to the mistakes and take ownership and responsibility, so you can get to growing. So I mean, if you don't like if you're making the same mistake over and over again, and clearly there's no ownership and responsibility being taken within those times. So I really think personally that making mistakes is really good, because then accountability can be practiced. So with that being said, I'll get into team accountability. Um, One thing I've learned about working really hard to build and form culture is that behavior drives your results of what your culture is going to look like. And I really do believe that accountability needs to be really aligned with behavior, and that behavior also needs to be in alignment with accountability. So there's this saying, um, there's a saying that goes around. I'm sure everybody's probably seen it, especially people involved in the sport world, coaches, or even players. But there's a quote that talks about like average teams, then you get your good teams in the middle, and then you get your great teams. Um, so those three levels, I think, with the good team and on down to the average, those teams are mostly only coach led, coach to player. The coach is doing all the talking, all the correcting, all of the handling conflict, and only the coach's voice is really heard. So then we'll talk about our great teams, and to me, the great teams that have what I'm about to say here, those are the teams that they're winning conference titles, they're winning national championships, national titles, world champions. Those teams have player to player accountability, where players are the ones doing all the talking, they're doing the leading, they're doing the hype manning, they're doing the encouraging, they're also doing the calling out on the wrong things, they're also correcting one another. And with that being said, that leads me into talking about the next thing. In order for player to player accountability to be formed within a program, there has to be a solid foundation. And that solid foundation really needs to be built on trust. That trust really needs to be a high priority thing. And it also needs to be modeled. And I think when you have a good foundation of trust, it makes it a lot easier to challenge and call out the inconsistencies of everybody in the group, when their actions aren't aligning with the strategies that are being laid out before them to grow a good culture and have a good team built there. So I'll get into some athlete accountability. Speaking of being on top of a solid foundation and having trust built, athletes, they have needs. They have things that they need to be laid out in front of them, that things they need to be modeled to them, spoke to them, constant reminders. And when those needs can be met, then they're able to perform accountability a lot better, and they're able to grow and get to a high level of accountability. So some of those needs that I believe that needs to be laid out for them, they include, clarity. Communication needs to be spoke very clear to them every day. In the environment that this foundation, the environment that sits on the foundation that's what needs to be solid and balanced with trust, that really needs to be a supportive environment. There needs to be as much positivity instilled in there as possible. And they also need to know what their roles are. For roles, you got your different positions on whatever team you coach. I mean, you might be a football coach, you might be a baseball coach, you might be a volleyball coach, all the things. There's going to be, there might even be a kid, that plays the same position on your team as another kid. So one thing that really needs to be spoke clear to those kids in that same position is, the playing time, because there's going to be athletes on every team that get more playing time than others, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it really needs to be communicated clearly so those athletes are able to know how they can be accountable to get great at their role. They also need to understand and have the values clearly communicated to them and also modeled and displayed. They need a lot of good constructive feedback, a lot of positivity, because when there is a lot of appreciation showed to them in that sense, they're able to, it makes them want to come back. It makes them want to come back every day and get better. It makes them hold themselves accountable in that sense. Like, I just got a good compliment. Coach told me I did great. Or like 5 other teammates told me, hey, I did really awesome today, man. I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'm going to do better for everybody. So And then the other thing that they really, really need, I believe this is one of the most important things besides that communicating, is um, they need to have all the adults modeling accountability themselves. So when they have everybody modeling accountability to them, then that, that gives them something positive to follow. So we'll get into a little bit more athlete accountability here. Um, Accountable athletes too, they also learn to have an understanding that they are responsible for all the things that happen to them. These are negative and positive things, because good things happen too. There's going to be good things that happen, and when they're able to grow into accountability, they're able to appreciate positive things, and they're able to navigate through the negative things. And another thing too is that foundation of trust. When they're able to be in a good trusting environment, I think this is really important to me. Is then they're then able to get to know what their strengths and weaknesses are, and when they're in a good supported environment, they're able to keep strengthening their strengths and moving up and doing the work to get better and better at that. But then when they're able to look at their weaknesses and they're learning accountability through that, then I think they're able to form a plan to strengthen their weaknesses in a way of holding themselves accountable. I mean, maybe they're journaling, maybe they're writing it down, or maybe they kind of formulate a plan on how do I strengthen this weakness. Or sometimes, maybe they even simply, they come to practice every day to put the work in, and maybe they write. Maybe they take a marker and they write on their hand something just to remind themselves, of what they're there to do, how they are there to strengthen their weaknesses. So I think, a supported environment is really important for that matter. Another good example of an accountable athlete, in that sense, is a person or an athlete that takes ownership and responsibility for the actions on how they're going to achieve their goals. So when they're able to hold themselves to a high standard and expectation, they're able to grow into their roles a lot better. And what I mean by that is they're able to take initiative and be responsible for their own preparation, and what I mean by that is, maybe they get up at 4 or 5 a.m. to get into the weight room before a class, or maybe maybe they have, between their busy day as a student athlete, maybe they have an hour or two break in their day somewhere. Maybe they're resting, taking their rest serious. Maybe they're taking their nutrition serious. Maybe they're taking their studies serious and having good time management to take some of their stress load off. And then maybe they're getting to practice, an hour early to get in extra reps, and they're taking some teammates with them. Maybe they're even staying late an hour after practice to get extra reps. That's to me what an accountable athlete looks like. I believe that's how they can display, good effort on and off the field. And, they know that they're responsible for their own skill building. So from there, I'll get into a little bit of coach accountability, a little bit about what that looks like. I think as coaches, we model accountability to everybody we work with, from our coaching staff to our managers to our athletes. We model it by, we have taking and showing that we have great responsibility and great ownership through our daily life, not just our coach seat. Because coaches, they're human too. They have other roles besides being a coach and a leader. I know a lot of great coaches who are parents, even grandparents. I know some coaches that have a high-level 9-to-5 job. I know coaches who are even business owners. So, when you get, I think people who can do all those things besides lead a team or an organization, those people are working hard in other areas in their life. and their accountability is really at a high level, you know, and they're people that come from all those different things, all those other roles, showing that they know that they are responsible and in control of their own personal growth, you know, and they're good communicators, and that, you know, they're already displaying that they live their life on a set of their own personal core values, and you know, they're living up to a standard and expectation that they're able to hold everybody else to with no problem. Because when it comes to holding everybody else to a standard and expectation and holding people accountable, you know, that's uncomfortable. And I think some of the best coaches have a lot of practice. They have years and years of experience and practice at displaying what a good accountability is. But I think to make it easier holding people accountable, you know, they really need to model that they're living their life accordingly. So I did use this quote to me that resonated with that. So what my quote read is, holding players accountable is uncomfortable, but having players fail because you won't coach, confront, or correct them is unacceptable. You know, I think as a coach, we do take an oath to serve people, and sometimes serving them means, you know, we're going to call them out. We might show a little bit of tough love. You know, we're going to correct them. You know, we might come down hard on them sometimes, but if we don't do those things, then we're doing our athletes a major disservice. So getting into my next slide, on slide 13, there is a coach that I have followed this guy. I've read a lot of things about him, so I wanted to use him in my presentation. Coach Clark Lee, he's the head football coach at Vanderbilt. And the reason I wanted to use this guy as an example is because what he did is he made it a point in his life to get in the best shape of his life as this head football coach. And you know, that's a whole life altering choice. I mean this guy, he clearly put in the time in the weight room, and that's a whole lifestyle change, because you know that he probably had to change like his sleep schedule, his eating schedule, you know, how he hydrates, you know, all the things. I mean, whatever his family life might have looked like, you know, how he was living, he probably had to like rearrange all his time management. So what I liked that he did with that is that he spoke on this, and he said, I made it a whole point to get in the best shape of my life so I could show my players that I practice what I preach. So I thought that was a great example to use. And then another thing that I really liked was this biblical quote. It's Joshua 24:15. So I'm gonna read to you the passage that talks about choice and accountability, and it says, "I will choose good over evil, and I will accept responsibility for my decisions." So what the prophet Joshua did was he decided that him and his family, his household, he made an executive decision to take responsibility when everybody was kind of going through this little disagreement time of what gods to worship and what gods to follow. And there was these different bands of people who were wanting to follow a different god, and so here's Joshua, and you know, I'm going to read to you what he states. So his moral example to me that he said is, "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So, which signified that him and his family, you know, they were going to make a commitment to worship God despite the choice of others. So, you know, to me that really resonated with how coaches choose to lead and coach their teams and what directions they're trying to take their programs to. You know, he talks about, you know, he's going to lead his family in a solid direction that he believes in, and I'm going to worship God. And he's going to do it without being influenced by what all these other people are choosing to do. And, you know, he's going to do it without being distracted, without making comparisons to the God that he chooses to follow. And, you know, I think leading teams, leading organizations, I mean, I think it's similar to me, and that really resonated with me. So to conclude my presentation here, you know, accountability, it's about taking responsibility and ownership for yourself to get to a greater good. And especially if you're involved with a team and a group of people, you know, there's a whole bigger picture there that you commit to, and that takes great accountability. You know, and I think accountability, you know, it needs to align with behavior so that, you know, your behavior can ultimately get the best results to have a really good culture. So, you know, and it means leading by example. You know, you function and you live your life at a high level of excellence. And to me, that's what accountability is definitely all about. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and have a good day.